Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Global History. I'm your host, Langella Sensei. And guys, you just finished the quiz on Section 1, which was Church Reform and the Crusades. Now we're on to Section 2, Changes in Medieval Society. Alrighty, so let's get started. So, as I talked to you guys before, Church Reform was still going on, and as we started to see a lot of these interchangeable parts or things going on at the same time, the Church Reform was going on, cathedral building was going on, the Crusades were going on. We started to see other major changes happening, and this was going on in medieval society. Remember, everyone got up and left to go fight in the Crusades. All right, most of the knights, most of the men had left, and now you really start to see really the remainder of the European towns and communities were now left to kind of take care of the long haul of everything going on. They had to make sure all the jobs were all the different work was being done, the farms were being kept. Everything had to now continue with the Crusades happening at the same time. And during the 1000 to 1300, agriculture, trade, and finance made significant advances than ever before. Towns and cities grew, population had increased, and now we started to see even more territorial expansion because of the Crusades and more interaction between Muslim groups and the Byzantine groups, and we started to even see new institutions be created, also known as the university, right? So let's take a look. So firstly, guys, big thing that happened was agriculture had changed, and we started to see a big revival in expanding the way that we farm, new techniques in farming and new ways to increase the food supply for itself. Okay, and what happened was climate started to get a little bit warmer, and we started to see new technology being developed to help increase food production. I had highlighted this first slide, this little dot here, because it's important. It's basically the overview that the fact is they were finding new ways to farm a lot easier. One of the biggest ways was to switch to horsepower. A lot of times farming was done using bulls, but now horses were now probably a lot easier to get a hold of because there were more of them, and they're native to Europe, so basically they were able to get horses. Now the difference was, in order to have a horse, you do need to have better food for horses, but having more horses available to you and the power that the horses had, the endurance, actually made a lot more sense to use them for farming. All right, so they were able to do 3 times the amount of work a day as the bulls were able to do. So this had really increased the food supply for them. On top of all that, they actually created a new system in which they could farm. They used to only use what they call the 2-field system, which pretty simple. It's only having one field plant for 1 year, and then the other field basically be kind of sit there and do nothing. Because remember, when you farm too many times or for a certain amount of years on one piece of land, the soil itself kind of deteriorates, as in it's not as rich, it's not as full, and it becomes very similar to like dust, right? And it loses a lot of its nutritional value to it that the plants and produce need to survive. So that's why they used to always have a 2-field system where one field was doing one thing and then the other field was kind of just sitting there not doing anything. But by 800, they started to create what they know as a 3-field system. So they would actually have 2 fields using for produce, and then let one field kind of be left to do nothing, to just rest. Like I said, it used to be two field system, but it changed to a 3-field system. By having this system in place, you started to see more food being produced, because now you obviously adding another field into it. You're able to produce more food, and it's kind of crazy because it's like such a simple thing, but by doing this, it actually increased the amount of produce they had available to people. Now, with this being said, more produce means more people now are being fed, which now gives people a stronger immune system, which means that now they are better against disease, and they lived a lot longer. And because of this, in the long run, population had increased dramatically, which is really important. Along with the increase in population, we even started to see the development of guilds. Now, what is a guild? A guild is an organization of people in the same business or occupation working to improve the economic and social conditions of its members. Now, what is a guild really? If you're comparing it to modern times, a guild is like a union, right? A union is made up of the people of the same occupation, and they're fighting for better working conditions, social conditions of all the people within that union. So when you think of what a guild is, that's the equivalent of a guild is a union. All right, so a merchant guild was really the first one we started to see. They made sure that the prices were kept up and controlled and monitored, so that there wasn't a specific group of merchants that were basically almost seen as like a monopoly that controlled all the aspects. It was kind of like a fair system. They made sure everyone was on the same page. And then we started to see even, other types of guilds be created, as in skilled artisans started to create. There's guilds with just with men and women, and other even types of craft guilds that were created. But the guilds are really important because they end up setting a standard for how products and working conditions and even wages were regulated, right? Because understand, without a unified group, everyone backing each other, everyone's kind of against each other. It's an open competition, and there's no real stability. Everyone's kind of going at each other's throat. But with a guild, with a unification, with a union, you start to see really a stabilization, or a kind of a fair practice. Listen, like everyone, we're going to compete, but we're all going to be on the same playing field, right? They're not going to be doing more messed up things to certain groups and to kind of get ahead. They're kind of just supervising each other, right? So within these guilds, they end up having more stronger practices to make sure that the people that are part of the guild are actually well trained, so that it's not like you have any poor, not like anyone that's inexperienced be a part of this guild. You have to gain experience over time, and it was a really strong method to develop really good workers of this time period. Now, when you look at how important these guilds do become, just think about unions, right? Unions have a lot of power when it comes to the workplace, when it even comes to government, because they have a lot of influence. When you have a consolidation of all the workforce in a certain area, then the government's going to listen. So they did gain that same type of influence over the economy and even the government itself. Now, with these guilds being created, we started to see better products with fairer prices in even small towns started to have access to them. But even probably the big thing that you could see was that not only was it small towns that had it, big cities had it, but they even had these things called trade fairs, right? Where basically they were giant fairs of markets where basically people can go buy different types of products, and they were all regulated by the guilds themselves. They became extremely important forces of the medieval society. All right, so I want you guys to answer this question up top. How did guilds change the way that business was conducted and products were made? I want you guys to answer that to yourselves. So what I did for you guys is give you a little chart here that actually discusses the different roles of the guilds, and this was specifically looking at craft guilds. So craft guilds form an important part of town life during the medieval period. They trained young people in a skilled job, regulated the quality of the goods sold, and were major forces in community life. So what were guild services? So firstly, to members, they had set working conditions that covered members with a type of health insurance, provided funeral expenses, provided dowries for poor girls, and to the community they had built almshouses for victims of misfortune, guaranteeing quality work, took turns policing the streets, and even donated windows to the church. Now, there are all different types of guilds that you can go into, but when you look at the basic makeup of what a guild is, firstly, you have the apprentice, okay? So I'll go over each group here. So apprentices, their parents paid for their training. They lived with the master and his family. They were required to obey the master completely, as if they were the patriarch. And they trained for 2 to 7 years and was not allowed to marry during this training. And then lastly, when the training had progressed to be the 2 to 7 years, they ended up transitioning to the journeyman. All right, so now the journeyman had worked for a master to earn a salary, so they basically now the underling to the master, but not to the same level as an apprentice. They worked 6 days a week, needed to produce a masterpiece, his finest work to become a master. They had to pass some sort of a test, very similar to a lot of all other jobs we see today, and had to be accepted by the guild to officially become a master. Now, when you are a master, you have your own shop. You worked with other masters to protect their trade, and even sometimes served in civic government. So it's a very good path. You have to go through many years of training to become a journeyman, and then even from that point, you have to work until you're accepted by the other masters to kind of be associated with that higher level of the guild. All right. think of it this way: when you just even for teaching, right? Most jobs that are good paying jobs that have stability have this type of concept where you have to start off as an underling and you learn and train for several years until you finally get respect enough that you become a veteran in that group. And that happens for a lot of different trades that we see nowadays. So for teachers in college, you basically are student teachers, or basically you are a college student and you're working as like a teacher underneath a veteran teacher for free. Like you're not getting paid to do it. You're just working for experience. And this veteran teacher, it kind of teaches you the ropes, gives you kind of methods and trial runs at teaching. And then when you graduate, you pass the student teaching kind of section, you pass the teacher exams, then you become basically a young teacher that's now has a certification, which is similar to like a journeyman. So what happens is when you get to that point as a young teacher, you need to now get a master's degree, and you also need to have 3 years of experience in order for you to get a permanent certification as a full veteran teacher, right? So that's like the journeyman method, as in you have to work, get 3 years of experience, and get your master's degree before you jump to becoming like a master, before you start now have a permanent certification as a teacher, and you can now get the full benefits that other veteran teachers do receive, right? So it's a very similar process that a lot of those high-paying jobs do have, right? So this is a very good method to follow. All right. So when you look at now with this increased in fair practices and fair prices, better conditions, populations increase, you start to see now a commercial revolution. Now, the commercial revolution means that with fair prices being around, better products going around, trade goods are now being accessed by more and more people, and now this has increased the amount of money flow going on, as in now these towns become more prosperous, and even to the point where the more poor people of this time period start to actually have more products than they ever had before. Now, trade fairs are really big money makers of this time period. All the different guilds were running these. They basically were held several times a year in small towns, big towns, to bring in a lot of new products of the time period. Now, it was a transition from it used to being a self-sufficient manner to now being more of a more trading society because of this commercial revolution. And remember, everyone left, and now you started to see a kind of a major opening for people to now move into the bigger areas. And because of the Crusades, we started to see trade routes be opened to Asia, North Africa, and the Byzantine ports. You started to see more wealth being kind of fluctuated throughout the Middle Ages, all right, throughout Europe, because of these new trade routes that were being opened. So you take a look at this graph. This is kind of a nice, kind of a straightforward graph that shows the commercial revolution. I think this is also in your textbook as well. With increased trade, guys, it actually had led to these three different things. Firstly, more workers were now needed because the demand for products was now being higher, and also the Crusades had left basically a lot of the workforce to be opened, right? Because now men were leaving, women now were taking over the household, and now even the remaining open spots, people were now hoping for more products to be sold, right? Population was increasing. On top of that, there was more money out available. Banks were now increasing. We're about to get into the banks because the basic idea is that when merchants were now going to these major trade fairs, sometimes they would buy a lot of products and they didn't have the money on hand with them at the moment. So they would take lines of credit and they would go to the banks and ask for, hey, can I, basically almost like the first ever credit card, or, you know what I mean? They would say, I need lines of credit. I'll pay you back with interest, but I need a big chunk of money right now so I can go buy a bunch of these products for my, from my workforce. And then the power that merchants had gained because of this is important to understand too, because of increased trade going on at this time period with population increasing. Now, each of these things have a cause and effect relationship. So because increased trade in the Crusades, all these blue things, these middle section here, had increased. And then because of this, more workers were needed. You started to see even serfs were actually allowed to leave the towns in which they were always bound to forever, to be able to move to towns and work for these different guilds, right? And then now, with more cash being in the flow and banking, there was more money available that the banks could now invest in new buildings, new public buildings, new stores, all these different things. And then lastly, with merchants now having more power in society, merchant taxes increase, and the king's power and wealth also increased because of that. So I want you guys to answer these two questions here. How did increased trade increase the power of the king? And number two, why would workers now have to be paid? So as I mentioned already in the last slide, businesses and banking had also increased in the amount of power, because when they would have these massive trade fairs, a lot of merchants wanted to need a large amount of money to buy a lot of products. So they need to ask basically the banks to basically give them a line of credit, to basically say, listen, I don't want to carry around all this money on me, but can you give me credit so then I can purchase these goods? Now, on top of that, the reason why credit was important was because with all the different types of merchants coming from all across the world at these massive fairs, there was all different types of currencies. So in order to basically keep it where they can maybe get currencies that would fit in for different areas, they would actually use credit to help them basically be able to make these purchases without making a problem. Okay, they end up taking out loans to make a lot of these different purchases, and which now gives banks a more influence over the economy itself. Because now think of it this way: with more merchants taking out loans to buy massive amounts of goods, the banks would then ask them for interest. Right, so the banks will be making money, and now those banks can now invest in new companies, and then they can even create new buildings and new companies as well. So the economy was just growing and growing from there. So I want you guys to answer this question here: why were the changes in financial services necessary to expand trade? And then you guys can answer that to yourselves. Now, as I said previously, with this new economic changes, it led to basically a growth of cities, and even had a now sense of paying jobs. Because remember, guys, feudalistic society, there wasn't a paid job other than if you were a knight and you were being paid by land, right? Same thing with serfs. You were being paid by basically living on their manor, right? That was your paycheck, right? And then you would, and on top of that, you would be paying the tithe, right, to the church. That's it. That's all. That's how you would live as a serf. But now with this increase in businesses and the economy, the population growth, people were now actually working and getting paid wages, right? Salaries. Now, as I said already before, I think I already mentioned some of this. The most important thing that you need to understand about earning a living wage and having people flock to different areas for work is these now smaller towns and even big cities had attracted people to come live with them. And instead of it being you live on the manor for the rest of your life, this actually allowed people to now leave, right, and go live into a place where work was needed, right? And we started to see transitioning, almost like a style of urbanization. And we'll talk about urbanization later on. I think you'll probably see more of it in Global 2. But urbanization is the concept where people were now leaving the farms and going to the cities. Now, I'm not saying that was like, it's not like they just made like a massive cities with skyscrapers and all that stuff, but it's the idea that even serfs, the peasants that lived on the manors their whole lives, actually were able to leave and go to bigger cities and work different jobs than just farming their whole life. Now, these new cities were not the same as like the old style villages or even the manors that people were more used to of that time period. So with the growing urban population, the population increasing, now people were leaving small towns to go to big cities, and even smaller towns were thriving in this economy. You saw a massive shift in population, 30 million people to 42 million from 1,000 to 1,050. 1,150, right? That's a big shift, okay? Now, with this massive urbanization, all right, the population increase, just think of how many millions, 12 million people in Europe increased. That means that towns are now becoming more compacted, all right? And there's a lot of issues. It gets too crowded, it gets too dirty, full of fire hazards, and there's no sewer system. So just imagine this. Imagine someone had to throw away the waste from, the waste that they had in the bathrooms. They would dump it into the streets. So the streets were just littered with people's waste. Just think how horrible that smells. Horrifying. And it was crowded, it was dirty, it was just not a good place, but the economy was doing well, right? People were making money, but it was just so overly crowded for them. Now, when I already mentioned this before, basically serfs serfs had to live in the same town for at least 1 year before they can transition anywhere else, which you started to see more often. Now, you started to see a shift in the social order between the feudal lords and actually the merchants that had basically had so much influence over the economy, right? Feudal lords were trying to increase taxes and govern towns, and this had caused a lot of resentment, a lot of anger from the merchants who were making the most money, to the point where merchants now had taken over the town. Also, they taken over by burghers, which was the town merchants, and they had demanded to lower taxes, and even resorted to force to make sure they lowered those taxes. So you started to see a shift from the feudal lords actually bending to actually abide by what the merchants wanted. All right, so now let's look into the next major impact that happened during this time. You know how I mentioned before that a lot of people really weren't worried about learning new things? Well, because of the Crusades, because of this contact between the Muslims and Byzantine people, a revival of learning did start to occur. All right, this new contact with other groups had made people want to learn new things, right? This cultural diffusion that was now being spread allowed people to kind of see new types of writing, new ideas, and it gives them a kind of new lease on life and learning new things. Now, the Muslim connection was really important because it gives Christian scholars new translations of Greek words, new ideas that the Muslims had believed in that may have been completely different from what the Christian groups or Christian scholars had ever known before. And on top of that, the Crusades had basically led to new ideas of navigation, weaponry, and even types of ships that allowed them to gain new knowledge in all these different aspects. All right. So I want you guys to answer this question here. This is going to go along with the two sections I already said. So how did the Crusades contribute to the expansion of trade and learning? I want you guys to answer that to yourselves. So with this new sense of learning, this revival of education, we started to see really new groups of scholars gather together and create almost like a guild of teachers and create the first universities that we know of, right? And to become a master teacher, a master professor, you have to complete 12 years of study within that field in which you're trying to do. All right, written works, not in Latin but in vernacular, so everyday language of their homeland. So now you started to see kind of different areas create their own, their own styles of reading and writing, very similar to kind of dialects, right? You start to see dialects of being of different areas. Understand that this concept of becoming a master, even in education, is very similar to what you see in colleges today. Most colleges, almost all colleges, are looking to have professors have a doctorate in something. All right, so to get a doctorate in any field takes a lot of time to get that. So it's very similar in the same concept. So universities, it takes a while for them to get a higher paying job in a college, and even in teachers, like to get a higher paying job in just a public school area or even private school, getting a master's takes more time than a just standard degree would take. So that's why the same concept here starts to emerge and is even shown in modern times. So one of the more famous people, a religious scholar, was Thomas Aquinas. You probably have heard of him. Colleges named after him before. He was he kind of mixed both Greek and Christian thought together, and he was what they call a scholastic. He's a university man. He is very intelligent, would raise a lot of issues or raise a lot of debates over major topics that were being debated. As in, one of the big debates that happened during this time was really how should governments be run and how they should continue from here. And this is a big major concept that probably got him under the heat a little bit, but it was kind of the start of the idea of when you start to see the Renaissance, right? The idea of all these new philosophical thinkers start to say, how should government be run? It really starts here with Thomas Aquinas. He really jumpstarts that conversation of how should we really organize our government to work effectively for the people, all right? So all right, that's going to be it for that one. So let's just go into the multiple choice questions. Which of the following best describes the nature of a guild? I'm going to let you guys answer these questions on your own today. What was the effect of the three-field system? How much did the three-field system increase the amount of land that could be farmed each year? And then which of the following functions did the guilds not perform? And I want you guys to answer these three main idea questions. Firstly, how did trade and finance change in the period from 100 to 1500? How did the growth of towns hurt the feudal system? And then 13, what role did Muslims play in Europe's revival of learning? Okay, guys, that's going to be it for today. That's section 2. Make sure you read the textbook and continue with that reading. It is really important to do. All right, guys, have a good one.